So yeah, I was just going to cover just the state of antibiotics, broad sort of an idea, but using a lot of data that we collect from around the world on various aspects of this. Obviously, some of the earlier slides, nothing surprising to you. We've always had resistance to antibiotics, either before they've been used in humans or, as was the case for penicillin, or soon after they've been introduced. So the emergence of resistance to any new antibiotic should just not be a surprise. And in fact, drug resistance is ancient. And the reason I make this point is because at some point, you'll start finding this stuff in places like the space station or other places. And of course, it's always been around. And the clever media person will ask you, oh, but if it's always been around, then why are we so worried about it? And the reason we're so worried about it is because of the fact that even though we've always worried about resistance, and it's been on covers of magazines, and in fact, these are all magazine covers from the 1990s, by the way, from the US. It's even been on the cover of Cosmo, and you can see how old that cover is because Brad Pitt is on the cover, so no one even knows who he is anymore. At least my kids don't. So, but the fact is that this has been a concern for a long period of time. But what has really changed is the fact that, oh, I can use this, is what started happening in just about 2000. It's like, the new millennium set in and resistance started rising, even though it was always around. Resistance has been ancient. That frequency, which was probably 1 in 100 million or 1 in a billion, whatever it was, started going up. And then, it got to the point where it's 1 in 100, which is when people can actually recognize it. And then you see the percentage of resistant isolates. This is carbapenem and third-generation cephalosporin and Klebsiella, starts going up dramatically and goes from, obviously, the bacteria don't stop at 1 in 100 because they've reached there. They keep continuing the rise. And, these started going up to 25, 30% in some instances. Now, this was a short video showing exactly the same thing. You see carbapenem resistance in Acinetobacter, and these are all from hospital isolates. These were data that were collected originally to drive pharmaceutical development. They were drawn from 200 labs around the United States, so a total of about 75 million isolates. We actually have all of that data. And it was collected up to about 2013 or so, and then someone decided that the company had to shut down, and they junked all the that data. We still have it, but there's not another repository per se out there. But if you play this forward from 99, where you see resistance is under 10% across the country, and if this actually works, yes, you see that the Northeast starts picking up, gets to about 40 to 60%. You see that same 40 to 60% in the rest of the country. You see above 60% pop up again in the Northeast. And the places where it's gray, it's no data. But by the time we've stopped in July 2012, it's gone from essentially under 10% to at least 40% and over 60% across most of the country. This is what has really driven a lot of interest in AMR as really being a public health issue. It's driven all of the reports that have come after. Obviously, there were always reports about AMR going back to the Swan report in this country, many, many years ago. It's probably about 45, 50 years old now. But, and many other reports, but this really was the one this is the kind of data that made sure that people recognized this was going to be a problem that was here to stay. This is CRE rates in kids. Again, you never really saw it. If it's under 1%, it's really indistinguishable from 0. But once you got to 2005, it starts picking up, and then suddenly people are concerned once you start having 5% of kids having it. So, and you see this repeatedly, dozens of papers, and these are not just in developed countries. It's also in developing countries where, the year 2000 was something which sort of, started this upward trend. Of course, some countries started before 2000 itself, but for many countries, these are data from a large hospital in Malawi in bloodstream infection isolates, and you see E. coli, Klebsiella, and other Enterobacteriaceae all going up, over the 2000s. And you note the y-axis, which is resistance, isn't just going up to like 5%. It's going up to 60, 80% very quickly. So again, not surprising, but it was again shocking for people to see. If you look across the world, there's high pockets of resistance in Latin America, in Russia as well, and in the Indian subcontinent. These are MRSA rates. If you look at ESBL producing E. coli, you see that the subcontinent and Southeast Asia, as someone pointed out earlier, is really the place where a lot of this action is happening. It's a combination of rising incomes and high bacterial burden, and of course, infection control not really being what it really should be, use of antibiotics in animals, all of which come together to create the perfect storm. And carbapenem resistance is a significant issue. Here you see it in Klebsiella pneumoniae. And Vietnam is again a place where things are of particular concern. Now, I just this morning, I pulled these data off from a website that CDDEP runs called Resistance Map. So it's just resistancemap.org, where we aggregate data from literally hundreds of labs around the world with which we have bilateral partnerships. And these come from many countries. You can pick the bug, the drug, you can pick the country, and you can figure out whether you want to plot this in a map or on a bar chart. And I just picked the bar charts this morning just to sort of give you an illustrative, an example of what you can do with that very large data set, which is all online and available. So Australia, so this is E. coli resistance. You see India stands out, South Africa for some classes, but UK is doing pretty well, as is, and the US is smaller in comparison. Pseudomonas, again, a particular problem in India, Vietnam, as you can see. And in Europe, there's obviously the Mediterranean bias, as you'll see very often, both with consumption and with resistance, that Spain and Italy and Greece are always going to be higher than the north of Europe. China is not as high as you might think. It's somewhere out there. And you can plot these again in terms of maps, and you can see the same Acinetobacter resistance to carbapenems that we saw earlier in the US, and you can see that resistance rates are upwards of 50% and sometimes even higher than that. They're high enough that sometimes we've tried to do these studies on newborns with carbapenem resistance versus not to look at attributable mortality, and you can't find kids, newborns, without resistance. Now this is, these are data which it's really ecological because it's data from different studies which are all plotted on ESBL carriage rates. Each circle is the size of the study, so it's pretty crude really. But if you try to fit a line, which these folks did, the Southeast Asia region is really where much of the increase has been happening, as you can see. Now, not everything is bad news. You do see some bumping around of resistance. You can see MRSA rates actually may have gone down in South Africa after 2012. There was a big national action plan adoption and a lot of attention on AMR. And you do see some reduction there, but not a huge amount, but certainly one which indicates that you might see something positive. These are our own data from carbapenem and cephalosporin resistance in Acinetobacter baumannii, and you can see again, it sort of peaks around 2006, 2008, and then seems to go down a bit. It's still overall increased from where it started, but it's not as if it's just rising inexorably. Now, we do worry when we look at these large data sets because a lot of them do come from labs attached to tertiary care hospitals, that perhaps we are overstating the problem of resistance because we typically tend to measure it in sick patients. We're not doing active surveillance in many of these places. And so we looked at just the US data, and this is what we found, that community hospitals may have as high rates of resistance, if not even higher, than tertiary care hospitals. Surprising to us because we sort of thought that tertiary care hospitals were probably overestimating drug resistance. And the reason for this perhaps is that there's not as good infection control in smaller hospitals. They don't have stewardship programs. So they may have the drawback of having sicker patients, which gets reflected in the antibiograms, but they also have the resources to really deal with it. Now, not everything that we know about resistance sort of seems to add up. Obviously, there's been a lot of penicillin use in India, and this is a 2017 study which shows that penicillin susceptibility in India in pneumococcal isolates is still really high. No real idea why, or there's not a good reason why, because it's not like there's been a vaccine introduced in India for very long. India has just introduced the vaccine. The neighboring countries all have high levels of penicillin resistance, but India alone stands out for having penicillin susceptibility. Now, that said, you still would be hard-pressed to find penicillin in a shop these days in India because the threat of resistance or the fear of resistance has essentially meant that many doctors won't really prescribe penicillin at all. So I think we need to worry about concerns about resistance driving people into newer generation antibiotics, which they may not need. So we have to balance this idea of communicating the problem of resistance, but without necessarily throwing the older antibiotics that work perfectly well out the window. And finally, when you try to explain this, obviously, to audiences that, for whom beta-lactamase doesn't roll off their tongue as easily as it does for all of you, this figure is particularly important because you explain this as this is sort of the number of keys that the bacteria have to unlock antibiotics, and the more keys they have, the more successful they are at unlocking or disabling antibiotics. And the sheer increase in the number of beta-lactamase enzymes, especially the newer, the metallo-beta-lactamase enzymes, is really of concern because this sort of shows that even if we had new antibiotics, they would have to come up better than a history of sort of, drug resistance and resistance genes that are already out there in the environment. Also, in terms of communicating this, we've tried to sort of come up with a single, stock market or Dow Jones or FTSE kind of an index, which is a weighted average of resistance to various bug drug combinations. And so not surprisingly, this was written up in The Economist. And what we do here is look at this drug resistance index in the 2000s versus in 2014. So that gives you a single index for every single country. You can do an index by gram positives and gram negatives, however you want to do it. And India was always high to begin with, so it stays there. Some countries seem to get a little better because resistance does go down or they have new antibiotics that are introduced. But for the vast majority of countries, the antibiotics are less effective, about a decade after we first were calculating this drug resistance index. Now, why do we care about all this from a clinical standpoint? Obviously, there's a burden of disease that remains poorly quantified. And mortality outcomes are really significant in two age groups. One are newborns. There haven't been many studies looking at the attributable mortality of resistance done in a clear way, but newborns are, in some ways, an easier population to look at because they anyway have high rates of mortality. So gram-negative, if it's culture positive, higher, obviously a much higher likelihood of dying. If it's a gram-neg, then it increases the odds even greater. And if it's ESBL or MRSA, then you're talking about at least a 50% chance of dying. In this particular hospital in Mwanza in Tanzania, in 2010, there weren't that many studies that we could use for this kind of, just to look at what was going on. But since then, there have been more studies. This study from New Delhi tracked 80,000 plus newborns in 3 of the best public facilities in public hospitals in New Delhi. And you can see the case fatality rate in culture-positive sepsis due to resistant pathogens, shockingly high. It's high even when it's sensitive, but having it be resistant makes it just that much worse. So this is where the bodies are buried, so to speak. And when we wrote this commentary on this paper to look at other studies, to look at case fatality rates comparably to the other one that was published in Lancet Infectious Diseases. And turns out that it's pretty similar. The study is on par, pretty similar for MRSA. And of course, for carbapenem resistance, there's not really many comparative studies. So we are looking at a significant proportion of neonatal sepsis deaths being caused by drug-resistant infections at this point. We use those in a Lancet Lancet commission. Was it commission? No, it's a series that was published in 2015. And we estimated the neonatal sepsis deaths attributable to first-line antibiotic resistance in 5 of the countries with the most sepsis, and the combined number was about 214,000 deaths. That's a pretty large number in terms of when we are making progress on under 5 mortality reductions. We're not making as much progress on newborn deaths compared to under 5, But then we have now this countervailing pressure going in the other direction in terms of drug resistance. So while some of the other causes of death may go down, drug resistance may increase that burden. And this has been covered widely, and obviously the threat is exactly this, which it poses a threat to babies in one country. In this case, it was India, and then also poses an overseas threat. The other population at risk is really, simply put, the rest of us, because if we all live long enough, we're going to have one of these procedures, all of which constitute modern medicine, colorectal surgery or hysterectomies or, cancer chemotherapy or appendectomies or whatever it is. So this is our ability to take advantage of modern medicine. And so we estimated using these absolute risk reductions of infections with antibiotic prophylaxis, which are quite high for some of these, like colorectal surgery. And we use this to estimate the number of averted infections and deaths in the United States. Meanwhile, we just published this paper just a few days ago, in fact, looking at what is happening to average infection rates in US hospitals for the most part. I think it has some non-US hospitals as well, for things like colorectal surgeries. Colorectal, we tend to have a lot of studies, and we see that the average infection probability went up from about 10% to about 25% over that 25-year period. I think that's pretty significant in terms of numbers. For the others, we didn't have as many studies, so there wasn't really a statistically significant result to be observed. It was pretty flat. But for colorectal surgeries, where the antibiotic is absolutely essential, it does go up. But when we looked at the number of additional infections per year modeled based on the absolute risk reductions, we found about 120,000 additional infections and about 6,000 additional deaths just with those 10 procedures. And these are all pretty important procedures in terms of how frequently they perform. Like colorectal surgeries, there are probably 300,000 colorectal surgeries in the US alone every year. I think it's the 4th most common surgical procedure, if I'm not mistaken. Meanwhile, UTIs, we heard about UTIs a lot from Lance this morning. He wasn't talking about UTIs that turn deadly, but that's really happening. You have increasing risk of dying of UTIs because of multi-drug resistant UTIs. And people are using colistin to treat UTIs. This is in India, for instance. Now, surgeries are not a thing which happen in just developed countries or even middle-income countries. There are many surgeries in low-income countries, and particularly in places where it's difficult to prevent infections because of poor infection prevention and control. About 92 million surgeries in low-income countries every year, about 5.5 million surgical site infections, about 6 per 100 procedures. And SSIs are the leading cause of infection in settings with limited resources. And mortality rates can be quite high, between 8 and 20% from having SSIs. So you think about this, all these folks who need antibiotics will get it for the first time, and the antibiotics won't work because the bugs are resistant. And about 400,000 to about 1 million deaths from SSIs every year, with an increasing number that are caused by resistant pathogens. In fact, again, this was a study that, again, we published just last week, or maybe this week, which is probably the largest study in a developing country of attributable mortality. This was based on a chain of hospitals in India, and we found that MDR E. coli infections were associated with 2 to 3 times higher mortality, and the mortality for MRSA was significantly higher than for susceptible strains, in particular instances. We found this across the board, so lots of results in there. And gonococcal infections. We obviously didn't have drugs to treat gonorrhea with in the 1920s, but we're pretty much back from 0 to 0 now in the 2010s, because there's no drug that reliably works for gonorrhea anymore because of resistance to ceftriaxone as well. Now, obviously, 1980s would have been the best time to have gonorrhea if one wanted treatment, but no good time to have gonorrhea, but one had to choose. Now is not really a good time. And of course, all of this spreads between countries. So NDM1 first detected in a patient possibly from India in Sweden, and it didn't take very many years, just about 4 or 5 years before it had spread to over 100 countries around the world. Same thing you see for MCR1. This paper was published only in 2015, and just a year later, this was published in 2016. So 1 year later, we had managed to put together enough studies that cover, I think, about nearly every country that had looked for MCR1 had found MCR1. So very rapid transmission globally. So all of these add up to it being really a problem which is not contained within any single country. Now, what are we asking of antibiotics? This is crude infectious disease mortality in the United States over the previous century. And what you notice is that penicillin was first used well after infectious disease mortality had declined because of sanitation, because of chlorination of water. All of these were responsible for reducing bacterial infections. It was not the use of antibiotics. In some sense, the post-antibiotics era is, people say, well, is that going to be like the pre-antibiotic era where we really didn't have antibiotics? It's going to be very different. In the pre-antibiotic era, there weren't all those surgical procedures and cancer chemotherapy that I'd shown you in the previous slide. So in some sense, it's going to be worse because we have depended on antibiotics for those procedures, and now we don't have them working as reliably anymore. But if you look today in South Asia, today, crude infectious disease mortality in South Asia is 2 times what it was in the United States in 1942 when antibiotics were first introduced. In sub-Saharan Africa, that number is 3 times. So we're effectively using antibiotics as our first line of defense in place of public health rather than as a complement to public health. That's simply unsustainable. We can't use antibiotics as a substitute for water, sanitation, hygiene, chlorination. Those have to be in place before we're able to do much with antibiotics. Otherwise, this big use of antibiotics just runs into a large number of infections, and that's not good. Vaccines are a potential tool which we have, which didn't exist in that pre-1942 era. You could see, the pneumococcal conjugate vaccine, most cited example of, this is data from the US, but there are similar studies from other countries as well, which show that introducing PCV7 reduced both susceptible disease and non-susceptible disease. This is a nice paper from the London School showing, the multiple ways in which vaccination against focal bacteria, non-focal bacteria, and viruses can control antibiotic resistance. And in fact, we have a study underway with WHO looking at how it's that entire thing can be reduced to a very simple figure, which is vaccination results in fewer infections, and that lowers disease burden and less transmission. That results in life saved. It also results in less antibiotic use, reduced selection pressure, and results in life saved. So we're going to do this across a range of pathogens and to see how AMR could be a metric or a consideration in determining which vaccine we really want to focus on. Again, going to big data, we've had antibiotic consumption data globally for over, I guess now, about 76 countries around the world. And we've had this for a while. The earlier studies were published in, this is 2014, I think, and then this one was just last year. And you can see that global antibiotic consumption has changed a lot. Between 2000 and 2015, consumption per capita across the world went up 65% in just that 15-year period. And in fact, most of that increase was just in the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. There was some decline in countries like the United States and in some countries in Europe as well because of the pneumococcal vaccine, and in Japan as well, which originally was a high contributor. But what you also notice is that there's a significant amount of heterogeneity across countries in per capita antibiotic consumption. There's Turkey at the one end, and Greece and Spain at the one end, and at the very other end is Central America and the Philippines or Mexico. Now, these folks probably want to consume a lot more antibiotics. That's because many people here don't have access to antibiotics. But their consumption right now is about a sixth or a seventh of what these countries are using here. The average Swede uses less than half the antibiotics that the average American does. The average Swede is not any less healthy than the average American. So it's not really clear that we're using antibiotics in ways that are actually productive from a health standpoint. And there's still a lot of heterogeneity here. When we look across countries by sort of income region, the high-income countries have sort of flattened out. But you see the upper middle income countries, these are all converging to the high income countries, which means that if you think that drug resistance the story is done and dusted. That's not quite true. We're going to see a massive increase in consumption in just humans over the next 15 years as these folks get up to being where they want to be, which is up there. And you can see that the high-income countries still consume far more per capita than some of these other countries do. So if you see continued growth, we'll get up there. So we're here now at about 40 million tons, or 40 billion defined daily doses, and it'll triple in the next, well, less than 15 years, in the next 12 years. If there's global convergence, then we get up here, and with no future growth, we stay here. So there's a lot to be done in terms of ensuring appropriate use, because while we have people who are overusing antibiotics, we have a lot of people who don't have access to antibiotics. And today, the access problem is important, but we also are facing a huge overuse problem simultaneously. Now, India consumes more antibiotics as a whole, not on a per capita basis, as a whole, compared to any other country in humans. But when it comes to animals, I'll show you in a few slides that picture changes quite a bit. Carbapenem should never really be sold in retail pharmacies, but you can see that huge amount of carbapenem sales in India and Pakistan in retail sales. Carbapenems are also used widely in the hospital sector in select European countries, and this is over a 16-year period. A lot of this is probably people responding to the fear of resistance and responding with carbapenems rather than it really being a high level of resistance that requires carbapenems in the first place. Non-prescription use of antibiotics is quite common. You can see that just because the places where people get access to care is not really from proper doctors. It's sort of these fake doctors which make up for the fact that there aren't real medically trained providers. And this is what passes for doctors, because take China or India, the number of doctors per 1,000 population is a small fraction of what it is in South Africa or the United Kingdom. The UK has probably 8 or 9 times the number of doctors per capita as India does. So to insist that people get a prescription before they get an antibiotic is simply infeasible in these places, because a lot of people could die because of lack of access to antibiotics. Now, the other big thing that drives antibiotic consumption is the flu season. I would say the flu season is the single biggest sort of driver of drug resistance, of drug consumption globally. Peak month of consumption is January across much of the northern hemisphere. It's June, July in the southern hemisphere. And then there are places like Singapore where it's year-round in a sense. In fact, we did this study a few years ago looking at whether we could use retail sales data on antibiotics to be able to predict ILIs, influenza-like illnesses in the United States. And what we found was that the fitted data, which starts with fit up to about 3 years and then project forward, you see the fitted data and the real data are virtually indistinguishable. We can do a fantastic job predicting flu just if we had prompt antibiotic use data, which we do at this point. So this is better than Google Flu Trends or any of those other big data tools that you can think of. Now, antibiotic use and resistance. So many years ago, Hermann Goossens published this paper which sort of gave everyone the idea that this is what we were going to find around the world. He was looking at penicillin use, outpatient use, and penicillin non-susceptibility in pneumococcal isolates. And it was this beautiful, almost, probably about 60-degree line into which all the European countries fitted in very nicely, and this paper has been repeated again and again, which basically was to make the point that the biggest driver of antibiotic resistance is antibiotic consumption. Now, sadly, that kind of an analysis has never been repeated because it's hard to do, and Europe is obviously a bit of a special place. And you have Netherlands down here and France up there, and they all fitted on this very nice line. Turns out that you can do that for some other countries. So we did this in the United States. We were looking at aminopenicillins, macrolides, and we were looking at prescriptions and then resistance. And very reliably, resistance would follow prescriptions by a 2-month lag. You could do that with all of the huge amounts of data that we were able to have and put to it. So it works really well in developed countries, and seasonality of prescribing does affect resistance. So you see the seasonality prescribing. Again, like I mentioned, you see the December bump, and the December bump always leads to more resistance down here. And this is seasonality of prescribing not associated with viruses. So it's obviously, as we use the viruses as a cross-check to see is there a link there, and we don't really see that link there, which means that the resistance is really the one that's linked to the antibiotic prescribing. Now, but we do know that it's not just antibiotic consumption in humans. There's a lot of other stuff going on. We live in this sea of bacteria, and I suppose some version of this picture has been shown many times at this meeting. And if we look across to see what else might be driving resistance, and we try to do that in a study that just came out a couple of months ago, we just collected all the data that we could put together on drug resistance, on antibiotic consumption, on availability of water and sanitation, health expenditures, infrastructure, governance, transparency, corruption, everything that we could throw at it. And this is obviously, the worst kind of ecological study you can think of. It is an ecological study, right? It comes with all of the usual caveats that you can think of with ecological studies. But we were looking at what sort of factors might contribute to global antibiotic resistance. And what we found, interestingly, was that when you look across a data set that's primarily most of the data came from developing countries, you actually did not see a link with consumption. In fact, the link with consumption was negative. However, we did see that resistance was negatively correlated with governance, with health expenditures, positively correlated with GDP per capita, assuming that's picking up a lot of the antibiotic consumption there, with education, infrastructure negatively correlated. So these are statistically significant. The usage in the multivariate analysis was not statistically significant, so that just sort of dropped out. But the fact remains that there's a lot of other things that are driving resistance. And the takeaway from this for us was, in countries which have terrible water and sanitation, sorry, this keeps moving, which have terrible water and sanitation, terrible infection control and prevention, simply focusing on antibiotic consumption is not going to do very much. A small pool of resistant pathogens can quickly make their way everywhere, and focusing on transmission of resistant pathogens may be as important, maybe even more important than controlling consumption. So obviously not a message that either jived with other papers that we'd done or with what people wanted to believe. And we did get a lot of pushback, and people said, oh, no, but it's consumption. It is consumption in places where you've dealt with the other problems, which is why you see that in the US and Europe. But when you have absolutely uncontrolled transmission of pathogens, then it's consumption, but many other factors intermediating that. So moving on to the environment, as you all know, 2/3 of the tonnage of antibiotics sold worldwide are actually used in agriculture, so that's where we should pay some attention. And I think someone, maybe it came up today as to why antibiotics are used in animals. And of course, the answer is that the veterinarians know that, this is true for humans as well, where antibiotics are used to treat kids who are severe acute malnourished, that there is some pickup effect that antibiotics have in the absence of adequate nutrition, adequate hygiene, having access to medical care or veterinary care in this case, or herd health, or the starter stock might not be good. So in fact, if you look at studies, so we plotted all the studies that went back to the 1950s. It says the same name because these are all in a sort of meta-analysis, or some of these are unpublished studies. And we looked at the studies which looked at percentage improvement in average daily growth of nursery pigs and growing finishing pigs. But what you find is that over time, that average daily growth of pigs fed antibiotics has been declining. Because if you go to a farm today, it looks nothing like the farm of 30 years ago. It's much more hygienic, much better nutrition, and really the need for antibiotics is far less. So we are using antibiotics more by force of habit than really because they're doing a lot for average daily growth in these farms. That is not to say that there are not many other farms in many parts of the world which do need the antibiotics, because that's really what's keeping the chickens alive. I'll show you one bit of data there. But one of the defining trends of our time, which is a forcing function for antibiotic consumption, is really the huge increase in demand for animal protein. Humans are consuming animal protein at a rate, or the rate of increase is completely unprecedented. If you just look at poultry, In India and China, in China alone, it's projected to go up, nearly double when you consider the increase in population as well. And you look at India, that's projected to grow, about 7-fold compared to 2000. That's a tremendous increase, and all of this requires intensified agriculture, which then depends on antibiotics because these animals are living in close proximity. If you look historically, since 1975, China consumes 6 times the number of pigs, and in fact, the total amount of pork in 2014 compared to in 1975. In fact, China has 6 times the number of hogs as the United States does, and the US has a lot of hogs. But the biggest hog producer in the United States is actually owned by a Chinese company. So that's where all the pigs are. They're all in China, and they consume a huge amount of antibiotics. In fact, if you look at the one species that consumes more antibiotics than any other, it is pigs in China. So the human consumption is this much, and animal consumption is this much, but China consumes half the world's antibiotics, with the majority given to animals. In fact, when we published this paper last year, this particular figure didn't make it into that paper because the editor said, what's the point of just saying that China has a lot of the world's consumption of antibiotics? So that was that, because that was more than pretty much all the other circles put together. You've got to follow the trends as to where the consumption is in animals and humans, and also look at water and sanitation, and you'll find the answer. So in 2013, global consumption was about 131,000 tons, but we're not done with this yet. In the next 17 years, that's going to go up to about 200,000 tons by 2030. So we're going to see some massive increases going forward, and then even beyond. All of this obviously has environmental consequences, because all of these antibiotics are excreted by humans and animals into the river basins, and this is just China alone. So into the 58 river basins in China. I don't mean to pick on China. I'm going to pick on India next. So this is just the very nice studies that are done now in China on environmental contamination with antibiotics and with resistance. There's a lot of good research going on there. But you also see this, which is diverse and abundant resistance genes in Chinese swine farms, and pretty much every kind of antibiotic resistance gene that any of you might work on, or any antibiotic that you might be looking for resistance to, all of this is found on those swine farms and enriched significantly compared to antibiotic-free manure. So we did a much smaller, well, actually not smaller, we did a more focused study in India of the same kind. So this is actually Charlie Brow, was an undergrad working with us. And we found high levels of ESBL in broiler and layer farms in Punjab. And if you go into these farms, you realize why the antibiotics are used, because without the antibiotics, the rate of dying, the mortality rate of these chickens is something like 0.5% a day, 0.5% a day, which means this is literally what's keeping those chickens alive. They're small, it's 46 degrees in the middle of the day in Ludhiana, the water is not great, it's probably contaminated. This is just life or death for these chickens, and that's why you see that reflected in the resistance as well. But you also see this, which is the pharmaceutical production, and this is in India, which pumps out antibiotics into the environment. In fact, you see these high rates of Cipro in the ponds surrounding these farms, and the rates, the concentrations are higher than what you should expect to find in patients if they're being administered antibiotics, and that's what these look like. So you have environmental contamination of various kinds going on. I don't want to get into slides on hospital waste, but that's a major source of resistance as well. But we're doing this experiment on a grand scale around the world in places where we actually have soil collections. Unfortunately, because of budget cuts, all the soil samples that would have value in the United States were destroyed. We're trying to unlock a few of them, but the Netherlands has some, and they see that resistance genes among soils show an increase over time, and it'll be interesting to see this over time from other places as well to sort of complement Mark's sewage study. And the environment is really where a lot of this transmission is happening. NDM1 found to be over 20 times greater in the Ganga River during the pilgrimage season than at any other time of the year. These are the mass bathing events. They typically happen. So in this particular year, that event was happening in June, and we were looking at February in this study. So this is colleagues at IIT Delhi, and they found that the prevalence of the gene abundance was greater in Rishikesh and Haridwar, which were places which had these mass-bathing events, but did not observe a similar effect in Delhi, where there wasn't such a mass-bathing event in the river. So you see increases in those places where you have these mass-bathing events. Obviously, the answer is not to say don't have mass-bathing events, but really the fact that we need to think about ways in which transmission is happening. So to conclude, we can make better use of existing antibiotics. That's great. There's a lot that we can really do. Or we can go out and find new antibiotics. I mean, the reason I put up oil as an example is because it's very much like that. Antibiotic effectiveness is a common resource, common to all of us. Each of us accesses it without really regard to what it does for anyone else. And the consequences are significant, particularly for those who can't afford anything other than first-line antibiotics. So if you look at second and third-line antibiotics for gonorrhea, much more expensive than penicillin. Now, penicillin went out the window in the 1960s because of first use in Vietnam and then resistance which spread around the world. So it's a problem that affects us all eventually, one way or the other. And some of us are able to get out of the problem simply because we can afford the newer antibiotics. But much of the world can't afford those antibiotics. They can only afford these antibiotics. And these antibiotics seem very cheap, but they're tremendously expensive for most people around the world. So many of us will pay with our wallets, but a lot of folks will actually pay with their lives, and that's what it drives concern here. We haven't had new classes of antibiotics. In fact, the last time a new class of antibiotics was developed against gram-negatives was 50 years ago. So we just need to be doing a lot better on that space. There is a pipeline of new antimicrobial drugs. There's various sort of partnerships and consortia like GARD-P, which is in Geneva, which are all trying to develop new antibiotics. But there's been a 30-year development lag, and we're paying the price now because this is going to take time to really build up. And even when antibiotics are developed, if you look at trends in development of new antibiotics, not new classes, just new antibiotics, between 1980 and 2004, of the 61 new antibiotics that were approved over that period of time, a lot of them, 43%, were withdrawn either because of toxicity or lack of market. And this is something that you folks would appreciate, which is drug resistance is important, but the proportion of patients who will have a multi-drug resistant infection that truly needs a brand new antibiotic is vanishingly small, right? The proportion is vanishingly small, but because the number of bacterial infections is so large that that small proportion translates into a very large number from a burden perspective. And you can do a back-of-the-envelope calculation. You start with 7 billion bacterial infections. The number that actually will need those antibiotics is probably 100,000 people. But that's like looking for a needle in a haystack. How does a pharma company find those 100,000 people to really go deliver an antibiotic to and charge them a high price? Virtually impossible to do. And when they just come up with another new antibiotic, they're going to have to run up against 200,000, it's not 200,000, 200 antibiotics that mostly work most of the time. And that's the truth of it. Most antibiotics work most of the time. It's just that in some proportion, which is significant in terms of numbers, not in proportions, they fail, and many of them fail simultaneously, which is what leads to the burden figures that we actually see. Because we also know that clinical failure rates and resistance are not exactly the same thing, and that's an entirely different discussion. So we have had new antibiotics, but wherever you see a box that is not fully colored, it means that it's a knockoff or a me-too drug of an existing antibiotic. So we haven't really had new innovation for a very long time. And the incentives, which they're all around getting a new drug to market. But we know from the very first figure I showed you that doesn't solve the problem, because unless you fundamentally change how we use antibiotics, that's like saying that the road is terrible and my new car breaks down every time, so I need to buy a new car. That's not the right answer. The answer is to really fix the road. And we haven't really spent a lot of time doing that. In fact, much of the money that we've attracted to AMR over the last 5 years because of advocacy, because of greater retention, has all gone to new antibiotics, or most of it has. That's not bad, but we also need a lot more in terms of conserving antibiotics and using them appropriately. So this is what that pre-antibiotic era really looked like. This is in 1899. This poor fellow, he tries to exercise on a plot of grass and he gets cut slightly and then it's a bloodstream infection and it gets amputated. Now, this is not going to be the predominant story, I think, of the post-antibiotic era. The post-antibiotic era is really about grandma wanting a hip replacement, but finding out that there's a significant risk of an infection that can't be treated and decides not to get a hip replacement. And that would be a true tragedy because that basically prevents grandma from taking advantage of what we would consider modern medicine. So, this is a lot like climate change. As you can tell, this is a global issue. What happens in one country affects all of the others. And there's a lot of options here. And in fact, if we're looking at just antibiotics as ways of dealing with bacterial infections in 20 years from now, at least I would be very disappointed if we haven't come up with some significantly different ideas. But this is where the current future extrapolated will lead to, which is that the newest antibiotics are, probably about 1,000 times more expensive than the ones that we still use in some cases. But the newest cancer drugs are far more expensive, and that drug, $31,000 for another 3 months of life. Now, some might argue that's worth another 3 months of life, but then what would people be willing to pay, or what should people be willing to pay for an antibiotic that essentially, prevents them from dying and lets them live for their natural life expectancy? I'm not suggesting that it should be $31,000, but if we don't protect the antibiotics that we have, we're headed to a future where it will be in the tens of thousands of dollars for the new antibiotics. And so it's not going to be necessarily the Jim O'Neill future of 10 million deaths or whatever it is. It's going to be deaths, but it's also going to be very expensive antibiotics. And we have to be prepared for that if we don't protect the antibiotics that we have. So I don't know if this came up yesterday. There's been a lot of action globally on drug resistance. There was a UN summit in 2016. There's a process to really get countries to do better. And some of this is working, but there's still not the speed at which we should be working. There's a very good resolution that was adopted at the General Assembly in 2016. In fact, some of the folks in this group, in fact, Mark was here as well, we've talked about using targets and funding to really achieve what we want to on AMR, because there's a limited window of attention on AMR, which we all need to take care of to promote science, to promote solutions, to promote interventions, to promote surveillance. But we also need to move to conserve the antibiotics that we have, and there's a lot of work to be done ahead on that. So as I mentioned, all the data, and I realize this is supposed to be a big data conference, so all the data, and these come from many different places, are all on this website called resistancemap.org that's run out of CDDEP. And I will have the slides up at cdep.org, so definitely in the next few days, or there might be an older talk in there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I know for all of us who work in the field, it's enormously useful to have such a comprehensive overview of the landscape. So we've time for quite a few questions.
This came up yesterday, and I don't think you were here yet, but one of the big challenges is empiric antibiotic use, right? So it's convenient and fast, but it's problematic too, because we know that, if 20% of infections are resistant to a particular antibiotic, we switch, right? We reach higher on the shelf. 20% of that resistant to that, we reach higher on the shelf. And yet, 80% are still susceptible to these older antibiotics, and that's the case largely for most antibiotics, right? So what we need are rapid diagnostics, and the technologies are out there, but the diagnostic companies say, well, show me the customer, and the customer, the clinician, says, show me the reimbursement, and the payers say, hey, empiric antibiotics are really cheap. So as an economist, what kind of studies do we need to do, and who do we need to talk to? Do we need to talk to payers, or do we need to talk to reinsurers, or somebody with a longer view? Sorry, that was a long setup, but.
No, that's a really good question. We sort of always think, well, we need better diagnostics. That's not necessarily true. In some cases, that's true. But in many cases, we have diagnostics, but they're simply not deployed because the antibiotic is cheaper than the diagnostic. So why would you use the diagnostic in the first place? Which is essentially the summary of your question. The the short bad news answer is that problem will take care of itself, because when the older antibiotics fail and we move to more expensive antibiotics and every antibiotic is $200 or $500, the diagnostics companies will find their niche at that point because the market will fix itself there. The question is, do we want the market to fix itself there or to fix itself when we have 50-cent antibiotics that still work? Now that requires an intervention, and that requires an intervention that makes antibiotics cheaper. Makes the diagnostics cheaper. Now most of you probably don't know this, but there has been a global financing facility to prevent drug resistance in the case of malaria drugs. So about 15 years ago, we had this problem with artemisinin drugs where the combination was likely to prevent the emergence of resistance, ACTs, but a lot of people are using artemisinin monotherapy. So a bunch of us economists, with a few smarter economists in the mix, like Ken Arrow, we said, why don't we actually subsidize the combination so that it's cheaper than the monotherapy? So this is a pure market solution to solving that problem. And the UK, Gordon Brown, came up with, I think, 50 million pounds at the beginning. At the end of the day, we had about 400 million euros or something like that. And that actually worked. It managed to bring the price of ACTs down from $9 per treatment course, which it was when that intervention started, down to about 60 cents. And that's the reason, I think that's one of the reasons why we don't have widespread resistance to artemisinins, because we managed to avert that improper use of artemisinins. Today, we have to do the same for diagnostics.
Next question.
Thanks for the talk. So my question relates to uncertainty in large global data sets. So when you move away from reporting on EU countries and start including lower and middle income countries, there are high levels of uncertainty in antibiotic consumption and so infection rates and prevalence. And so particularly when you put these together into an analysis like the one you showed where there's a negative correlation between antibiotic consumption and infection rates, was it? I'm just wondering how you convey the sense of uncertainty in the underlying data and the model when you give those sorts of headline findings.
So I think I said about 4 times it's an ecological analysis with all of the caveats, and probably I didn't list the caveats, but you're absolutely right. The data are not uniformly good wherever you are. You can adjust it to some extent with your sample size when you get, because these are all extrapolated samples, right? So the antibiotic consumption data, you probably have 90% of the capture from retail pharmacies in the UK. You probably have a 10% capture in Mozambique, perhaps. So we do adjust for that. In fact, there are uncertainty analyses behind that in the supplementary analysis. So it might be worth taking a look at. And we do have confidence errors on the confidence bars on the data that we put on consumption as well. So they will be much larger, obviously, for the developing countries. And again, for the multivariate analysis, it was not negative. It was just flat. It was non-significant for the consumption. But your point is very well taken. We just don't have very good data in the developing world, but that's not a problem that's unique to our field. That's unique. That's a problem for any data that comes out of these countries.
Very nice talk. One thing I considering doing after listening to your presentation is going into chicken farming. That's on a lighter note. Earlier you had mentioned that there's this 30 years development gap with regards to antibiotics. So I was just wondering what was responsible for that gap, or what could be responsible for that gap.
Well, we know what was responsible for the gap. It was because by the 1960s, most of the 15 compounds from which all of the modern antibiotics are derived had all been discovered by then. And so simply put, there was a big glut of antibiotics then. And there was also a perception at that time that infectious disease were history, that we had dealt with it. There was sort of the feeling after smallpox eradication in 1980 that smallpox is done, what's next? Let's get rid of malaria next. I think the euphoria around infectious diseases back then was such that someone of that era would not even recognize today's era, because they would have thought that infectious disease would just be gone by now. And consequently, people said, okay, let me look for something else that I can make some money on. And they moved to, obviously, psychiatric drugs or statins and so forth. So But the resistance also that we always knew about, right, from Fleming's lecture or any of that, didn't actually show up to be clinically relevant to a significant proportion of the population until I would say the year 2000. When I first started working on this, I don't think I'd ever seen data on carbapenem resistance in the mid-1990s. There was none, right? And you really didn't even know patients who died of drug resistance back then because there were none. It was all very hypothetical, but I think we underestimated also how quickly it would go from that under 1% to that 50% number in such a short period of time. So that's what's happened, and we should have been prepared for it, but we weren't, even after being on the cover of Cosmo. So.
A very short following-up question, actually, got just inspired by his question is, do you really think there have been never an adaptation back, like that bacteria lost basically the antibiotic resistance? Because maybe we should also think about getting a little bit creative, think out of the box, and actually work against the resistance, the adaptation process, and not only against, like, you know what I mean? Like, if there ever have been a case where you can see that it clearly goes back.
You know, that's a great question, and I hope that that's where a lot of research will actually go. You know, I talk to companies all the time. There are companies that are looking at adjuvants to go with antibiotics to reduce the likelihood of resistance. There's a company that, you know, in this field we sort of call the, you know, the charcoal company. That's a flippant way of putting it. There's a company in France which actually is trying to make some variant of charcoal which you ingest with antibiotics that essentially absorbs antibiotics in the gut so that your gut bacteria are not exposed to antibiotics at the rates that they are right now. And then I don't remember the name of the researcher, but there are at least a couple, one at MIT and one at the University of Washington, who are looking at ways of reversing mutations. So I think this is all very productive, and I think that honestly, hopefully all of the public health emergency that we face today will translate itself in some very creative ways of dealing with drug resistance over the next 20 years. And if we're still sort of dithering around and saying we need to find a new antibiotic 15 years from now, we're toast.
Thank you very much, and do call Ramanan over tea with more questions.
Thank you.